For further insight now, we are joined in studio by Chen Herzog of BDO. Thank you very much for being with us today.
Hello.
Well, I want to first point out what appears to be somewhat of a paradox here, because in this report, Israelis rank themselves quite highly in terms of relative well-being, subjective well-being, and happiness. And yet at the same time, the same report depicts a rather scathing picture here, pointing to a crisis in housing, the cost of living. How do you explain this paradox?
Well, you can look at this report as Israel's annual report card. We've been graded by the OECD, and it's an opportunity to look in the mirror and see how well we're doing. And one of the interesting indicators in this report is indeed the Better Life Index. We all want a better life, and this index tries to see how Israel is ranked in terms of better life indicators. And it's quite interesting. When Israelis are asked subjectively how they see their life, they rank themselves pretty high. Number 5,
you're saying.
Right, because it's like a student, you're asking how well are you doing in school, and you think, I'm an A student. But when we're looking at your actual scores in the Better Life components, the scores are not very good. We see the student failing in some of the most important parameters or exams in terms of education level. We have one of the lowest in the OECD. It's very alarming in terms of poverty, in terms of housing condition, in terms of environmental conditions.
So what is this? Is this cultural?
No, why are we? Why do we see ourselves as more? It's not. Well, it is cultural, but it's also a relative index. And you have to remember that many European countries are now in the middle of a crisis, of a slowdown. So they are looking at themselves from a negative point of view. But it's not an objective indicator. And we look objectively, the results are quite alarming.
All right. And of course, they did mention these negative elements that are affecting people, such as housing and the high cost of living. Can you extrapolate on that a bit? Yes.
One of the key issues here, indeed, is outlined in the OECD report, is the housing problem in Israel. And we all know and talk about the problem of high housing prices, the cost of living. But the OECD takes it into another dimension and actually stipulates the other factor, that we live in smaller houses, that our housing condition is relatively inadequate relative to other OECD countries because of the high cost of living. And another factor is the cost of food. The cost of food in Israel relative to our income is higher. And the combination of these two factors, high cost of food and high cost of housing, which are both essential parts of our consumption, means we are left with less resources for other consumption factors, for education, for health, for leisure.
Interesting point here. But at the same time, the same report did highlight some positive fundamentals in the economy and consistent growth. Can you also outline some of these details?
Yes, the basic parameters of the Israeli economy are quite positive. We enjoy a high level of growth. We enjoy low inflation. Our budget deficit is low. So the fundamentals are quite positive. But if we look at the message coming from this report, and the conclusion of the OECD is that the growth in Israel is not all-inclusive, which means that we enjoy growth, but we are not able to penetrate the fruits of growth to all the segments of the society.
Right, it's mostly felt just at the top.
That's right, and there are two significant sectors, the Arab population and the ultra-Orthodox population, where the poverty rates are high, and these populations are also identified with large families, many kids.
And I want to talk about that a bit, because we also wanted to highlight labor. And it is commonly understood that the ultra-Orthodox community is not participating as much in the labor force, right? Mm-hmm. And so at the same time, generally, though, in Israel, we're seeing high labor participation rates. So what's going on here in terms of poverty?
Yeah, exactly. If you look at the recent years and OECD indicators, they indicate that the level of participation in the workforce in Israel increased in the last years, and currently we're even higher than the average OECD. But there is an anomaly here. We work more, and even though we have high poverty rates. So it's very disalarming, because usually when you have poverty, the trivial answer will be, well, go to work. And here we see populations that are more and more entering the workforce and working, and even though they're working, they're not earning enough to sustain their to reduce inequality.
Okay, staying on that topic of inequality, I have one burning question for you here. Back in the 90s, we saw that this rate was standing at somewhere around 14%. Currently, that line is 21%. What happened?
Okay, so we see poverty reducing, but we don't see it going enough into the low classes. And I think one of the problems here, as we mentioned, is education, and the other is infrastructure to allow those people entering the workforce to achieve sustainable and high-income salaries.
Well, thank you so much for bringing this to our attention. Chen Herzog of BDO. That wraps up our show today. Do stay tuned here every day for all your global economic coverage. I'm Natalie Ehrlich. Thank you very much for watching.